exactly how it shapes the county to this day, we've got to go back in time a little bit. Really, it's probably most appropriate that we start our narrative exploration of the Arlington Line fortifications long before the fortifications are ever built. Oh, sorry. All right. So as sort of a prologue to all of this, we have this idea of holding the southern shore. Now, how the United States government, how the Union Army can hold the southern shore of the Potomac River is really going to dominate a lot of the thinking that goes into the eventual development of the Arlington Line fortifications. The image that we're looking at right now is kind of a weird one, but it's one I always like starting my virtual programs with. This was entitled District of Columbia and the Seat of War on the Potomac. This was a print that was circulated at the time. Now, the exact topography, the orientation of the map sometimes throws people off, but to put it bluntly, right now what we are looking at is Washington opposite Arlington heading up the Potomac River. So you have Washington and Alexandria right at the bottom of the picture, and then as you travel further up, it's the Potomac heading towards modern-day West Virginia, the like. I love this image because when you take a look at it, you really appreciate how, at the very outset of the American Civil War, Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, the seat of all federal authority in the United States of America, really is surrounded on all sides. If you were to pick any name in isolation from this map, any place that that pops up here, be it Bladensburg or Rockville or Falls Church or Harper's Ferry, if you were to look up the newspapers that those places are producing, the news coverage that's coming out of these places, all in the early days of the American Civil War, you would almost always see some story of clashes between Union and Confederate sympathizers. This could be full-blown military occupation, like you'll see in Harper's Ferry. This could be Union and Confederate rioting, like you'll see around Bladensburg. If you are the average Washingtonian, it has to feel like the proverbial noose is closing in on you as more and more people in your local area start to come around to that secessionist way of thinking. Even Georgetown is going to come under suspicion for housing a number of pro-secessionist organizations throughout the war. So you can't even trust people within the district. Now, that being said, though, if you are a District of Columbia resident at the start of the Civil War, all that news could be scary, it could be ignored, but there's one thing you definitely cannot ignore, and that is that little strip of Virginia just opposite Washington, D.C. I'm talking, of course, about what was then known as Alexandria County and what is today Arlington County. If you look right where Washington bridges over into Virginia, that's where you're going to get your best view of Alexandria County on this map. Now, there are a few things about this little connection that, again, really need to be emphasized. The first is the proximity. At about its narrowest point, there's only about half a mile of Potomac River water separating the southern bank of the Potomac River in Arlington or Alexandria County with the northern bank of the Potomac River just opposite Georgetown. Now, at the outset of the Civil War, cannons have advanced to the point where they can hit targets over a mile away, over 2 miles away. So the United States is going to realize at the height of this secession crisis that if the people of Virginia give into secession, it will place the federal capital squarely within cannon range of an enemy state. Now, there are also a few other factors to take into consideration when you start looking across the river to Alexandria County, and we can make out some of those as well. If you start to look at the residents of Alexandria County, the average District of Columbia resident might hope that they would be trustworthy, but as the secession crisis progresses, that may be thrown more and more into the air. Of course, the main feature you're going to see on this map, just opposite the bridges, is the Arlington House. In 1861, as the Virginians are voting to secede, this will be the home of the Lee Custis family. Robert E. Lee, just prior to the secession crisis, was a colonel in the United States Army, and for all intents and purposes, many considered him to be one of the best professional soldiers that the United States Army had. Now, he will resign his commission in the United States Army after the firing on Fort Sumter, but before the people of Virginia formally vote to ratify the Ordinance of Secession. So already you are going to have some of the most prominent residents of Alexandria County start to throw their lot in with the South and start to leave. And again, this all coming from a house that is within eyesight of Washington, D.C. Now, if you travel a little further north from the Arlington House blip, you'll see two other names, Vanderwerken and Gary. These are two more residents that are really going to encapsulate just how messy this, the lead up to the Civil War in Alexandria County will be. Now, Vanderwerken was not a native Virginia. Gilbert Vanderwerken was a somewhat large farmer in North Alexandria County, someone who had only been in the county for a little over a decade, I believe, before the Civil War breaks out. Now, Vanderwerken has been living in the greater DC, Alexandria County area for quite some time, and he has a fair amount of contacts on both sides of the Potomac. As the Confederate militia begin to creep their way into Alexandria County prior to the secession vote, Vanderwerken will be informed that Confederate militiamen have been to his property and have confiscated his horses and his oats, both of which have been taken to Alexandria City for purposes of supplying the growing Confederate presence. Now, Vanderwerken will travel all the way down to Alexandria and have a meeting with one of the Confederate officers. While there, something will happen. We're not sure what, but something will happen that will allow Vanderwerken to leave Alexandria City with his horses, but not his oats. This is going to become a major sticking point in the Vanderwerken story after the Civil War, because as Vanderwerken tries to prove that he was a loyal Union citizen throughout the war, he's got this little interaction hanging over his head. The obvious question being, how were you able to get your horses back from the growing Confederate Army? Were you that good of a friend to the Confederate officer that that was allowed? If so, what does that say about you? And if not, what did you have to give up to get the horses back? In a different side of the angle there, we also have Gary's house. This is likely a reference to William Gary, who prior to the Civil War was a captain in the local Virginia militia regiment, and who, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, had actually been appointed captain of Alexandria County's slave patrol. Now, in spite of that prominent position policing the enslaved population of Alexandria County, he was actually considered one of the more prominent Unionists to have property in Alexandria County. And during the secession vote, supposedly, he was arrested by the Confederate militia, imprisoned in the Alexandria jail, and informed that as soon as the secession vote was over, he had to leave the state of Virginia. Now, what these three stories tell us together is that not only is Alexandria County close enough to Washington that it can be a problem strategically, but that the population in Alexandria County may or may not be the most helpful. Those who seem like they will be helpful may have skeletons in the closet, and those who may seem like they won't be helpful could actually contribute more to the Union war effort than the average Union soldier might expect. All of this points to a very strong need for the Union presence to enter Alexandria County as quickly as they can and in as great a force as they can. Once they do so, they can begin the process of defending Washington from the south side of the Potomac. They can begin the process of preventing any potential bombardment of Washington, and they can begin to extend federal authority into the secession states. Now, on the evening of May 23rd, 1861, the U.S. Army will begin that effort. Roughly 6,000 Union soldiers, most of them militiamen from New York and New Jersey, will begin a silent march across the various bridges that connect Alexandria County to the District of Columbia. And by the early morning hours of May 24th, 1861, just about every inch of Alexandria County will be occupied by the Union Army. So it's a very rapid occupation that is by and large a complete success for the Union Army. Now, this success, though, is going to be largely predicated on how well the Union Army can take advantage of their newly acquired territory. So here we're going to enter three of our big names to the Arlington Line story. First and foremost, right here at the center of our screen is Brigadier General John Gross Barnard. John Barnard was, prior to the war, a member of the U.S. Engineers. At the time, the U.S. Engineers were considered to be the most prestigious branch of the Army that an officer could enter into. Barnard had graduated from West Point in 1833 at second in his class, so he was quite smart. On top of all that, he was only 18 years old when he did it. Joining him in the Department of Washington will be two subordinate officers. Then Captain, later Major, Daniel Phineas Woodbury, and then Captain, later Major, Barton Stone Alexander. Woodbury and Alexander will be the boots on the ground engineers that are going to coordinate the larger defensive strategy that is largely planned out by Barnard and the other commanders of the Department of Washington. So this team here will be responsible for outlining whatever Union defensive system will eventually go up in Alexandria County. Now, in the lead up to May 23rd, 1861, Barnard and his engineers know that they really can't wait until the Union Army arrives in Alexandria. Everyone at that point is pretty sure that no matter what happens on the day of the May 23rd vote, one way or another, the Union Army will need to enter Alexandria. But they don't quite think it would be prudent to do so before the vote actually takes place. In the meantime, though, Barnard doesn't want to wait that long to start planning the defensive line. Now, because Virginia has not technically seceded before May 23rd, 1861, it's not impossible for Union engineer teams, most likely led by Woodbury and Alexander, to cross the bridges, enter Alexandria County, and begin making preliminary plans. This is something that Barnard will say was absolutely impossible to do around Alexandria, where the Confederate force is really starting to congregate. But in Alexandria County, you have 3 bridges connecting the District of Columbia to the county. And in his words, the few guards that are left by those bridges aren't even armed. So by the time the Union Army arrives on May 24th, 1861, Barnard, Woodbury, and Alexander already have a very good idea of what they need to do when they need to do it. So that brings us to what we can pretty calmly consider the first stage of the construction of the Arlington Line. This initial wave of construction will begin that very night in those early hours of May 24th, 1861. During those hours, the 2 main columns of the Union militia will cross via the Aqueduct Bridge and the Long Bridge into Alexandria County. Leading the column from the Aqueduct Bridge are the 69th New York State Militia. The 69th New York State Militia, after crossing the bridge, will go off to the side and wait for the arrival of entrenching tools. Once the entrenching tools arrive, they will begin work on one of the first forts to ever go up in Alexandria County, Fort Corcoran. Now, at the same time, a column of New York and New Jersey militiamen are going to cross the Long Bridge. In those early morning hours, the New Jersey militiamen will also begin work on one of their fortifications, Fort Runyon. Now, in both cases, the construction is overseen by the engineers and is laid out in places not too far from the bridges themselves. We're not yet driving deep into Arlington. We just need to create 2 strong defensive locations that can protect the bridges at all costs. In both cases, the forts are going to be named after the various commanders of the regiments that build them. Fort Corcoran was named after Michael Corcoran, colonel of the 69th New York State Militia, which is going to achieve great fame during the Civil War as the 69th New York Infantry, part of the famous Irish Brigade. In fact, if we look at this picture of the officers of the 69th New York here on the left-hand screen, you can actually see Michael Corcoran to the far, far left, standing up with his hand on one of the wheels. Now, regarding the construction of Fort Runyon, Fort Runyon is, like I said, primarily going to be built by New Jersey militiamen, but also with the help of New York militiamen as well. They will name the fort after General Theodore Runyon of the New Jersey State Militia. This is one of those moments where tracking Civil War units gets really difficult, because in this early day of the occupation of Alexandria County, you have all of these militia units from individual states. So you have, a major general in the New York State Militia overseeing this giant movement. You have a general like Runyon leading a brigade of New Jersey militiamen straight into the county. But they are all taking orders that have been laid out by colonels and brigadier generals in the US regular army, and that makes following the individual chain of command quite difficult. But all you really need to know on that front is that regardless of the rank, the various militia companies are ultimately following the direction of Woodbury with the 69th New York and Alexander with the New Jersey Brigade. Once these 2 fortifications are built, the Union Army is pretty quickly going to spread out just a little bit. Like I said, the engineers know that the location of neither Corcoran nor Runyon is perfect, and so there are some immediate blind spots to the defenses that really need to be covered. As such, once Corcoran is built, the Union Army will build Fort Bennett and Fort Haggerty not too far away, and then the Union Army down by Runyon will support that with the construction of Fort Albany. So by June of 1861, you have 5 Union fortifications being completed in Alexandria County. Pretty soon, this number will grow exponentially. The cause for this exponential growth really shouldn't be that surprising, because while everyone hopes that they can get away with just constructing a few short temporary defenses until the war ends, the Union Army quickly realizes that the war will not be ending anytime soon. On July 21st, 1861, the Union Army will suffer its first major defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run, immediately after which the defeated Union Army will retreat all the way back to Alexandria County, with the Confederate Army pursuing as far as Falls Church. So, whereas the Union Army will take up positions on the Arlington Heights, at Hall's Hill, at Ball's Crossroads, at Arlington Mill, the Confederate Army will stop at Bailey's Crossroads, Miners Hill, Munson's Hill, Upton Hill. The border between modern-day Falls Church and modern-day Arlington essentially becomes the border between the Union and the Confederacy. And for about 2 to 3 months, there's a pretty fierce standoff between the 2 armies, not knowing who will strike first, and if so, will it seal the fate of Washington, the Union, and the Confederacy. So while the Union Army waits, they are going to begin the next major phase of fortifications. Forts Craig, Tillinghast, Cass, Woodbury, and DeKalb are going to be constructed north of Fort Corcoran along the proper Heights of Arlington. The Heights of Arlington had always been the major objective for Barnard and the engineers. They were the real reason why Arlington County has to be invaded so soon after the secession vote.
John, excuse me.
Yes.
One of the people in the audience was wondering if you could try and provide a present day location when you mention a fort.
Oh, sure. I would be happy to.
Okay, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. And regarding that, if there are any forts that I overlooked, because again, many of those fortifications sadly are no longer here except for a sign at a crossroads. But I will try to lay out exact locations as I can. And fortunately, from here on out, it's going to get a lot easier. If we want to go back a little bit, okay. So Fort Corcoran, again, sadly, none of Fort Corcoran is still standing, but of all the forts in Arlington County, this one is by far the most photographed. So if you want to see Fort Corcoran, all you need to do is open up Library of Congress website, that's loc.gov, and you can find countless pictures that were taken there throughout the war. That would have been located not too far from the Government Center, give or take. Runyon is a lot easier to pinpoint. Runyon is built pretty much right next to the Long Bridge. So if you have ever been to Long Bridge Park, there is a large Boeing building just next to it. Now, Long Bridge Park doesn't do any interpretation for Fort Runyon, but actually the Boeing building does. If you walk in front of the Boeing building, on the sidewalk just in front of it, you can actually read a fair amount of interpretation that was put in there for Fort Runyon and for the Civil War history of Long Bridge proper. So it's actually not a bad little historical spot to pay a visit to if you are looking to take in a Marymount game or what have you. Now, again, here when we get to this new wave of fortifications, this July rush to hold the Arlington Heights, here's where it starts to get a little trickier. Now, of the the 5 forts that we're looking at right here, you are essentially looking at the ground from modern day Fort Myer all the way up to Spout Run Parkway. So Forts Cass and a couple other forts that we'll talk about later will eventually be incorporated into the modern day Fort Myer. Fort Craig, Fort Tillinghast, those are a little bit further in, so you're kind of looking around the Arlington Forest area. Now, Cass is actually going to be built a little bit closer in towards Arlington proper. Again, right now I'm being very vague with the exact coordinates, but fortunately, many of these fortifications actually do have easily searchable historic markers that were put up by the state of Virginia. If you're curious about Fort DeKalb, Fort DeKalb will eventually be renamed Fort Strong, and Fort Strong is the modern day location of the Fort Strong apartments. If you go to the Italian store regularly, like I do, it's a hop, skip, and a jump away from there. Now, Barnard always believed that it was this group of forts that was going to do the most to physically protect Washington. While Arlington County has many fortifications in it by the end of the Civil War, they all serve different purposes. Some, like Corcoran and Runyon, protect bridges. Some are designed to protect/threaten Alexandria City. These fortifications are the fortifications that, in Barnard's mind, were the proper Arlington Line forts. They are built all along the heights of Arlington, and they are the ones that block actual Confederate bombarding range from the federal capital. Now, we're pretty lucky here in that we've got a number of really great photos of these miscellaneous forts right around the time they would have been built, 1861 to 1862. So here we're looking at photos of Fort Craig on the left-hand side, Fort Woodbury on the right-hand side, and then right here in the center, we have a photograph of the 9th Massachusetts Infantry at a little place called Camp Cass, located on the Arlington Heights. Now, one of the questions that I was asked before planning this little program is if it would be possible for me to talk a little bit about what makes a fort, what makes a battery, and especially what makes a camp. Camps are some of the topics that I get asked about the most. If I know where this camp was located, if I know who stayed at this camp that we know about. Camps are very hard to pinpoint. The reason being that, much like forts, camps are almost always named after the commanding officer of whatever regiment builds them. And as such, when that regiment moves, the camp moves with them. So a great example of this is Camp Casey. Camp Casey will emerge in Alexandria County in the mid-1860s, first as a camp of instruction and distribution for new Union soldiers throughout the Army, but will soon develop into a camp of instruction and distribution specifically for African American soldiers, soldiers with the designation United States Colored Troops. And as such, Camp Casey has evolved into possibly one of the most significant Civil War locations in Alexandria County that we just don't have an exact location for, because there was a Camp Casey in Washington, D.C. that we know about. The Camp Casey may not have always been in the same place once it arrived in Alexandria County. So while I can't say for certain that Camp Cass in Arlington becomes Fort Cass in Arlington, sometimes that can provide a pretty good window into where some of these locations might have cropped up, and in the case of photographs, where some of them may have been taken. It's one of the bits of this job that really ensures there's never a slow day at the Fort C.F. Smith Research Desk, because there is just so much about Civil War Arlington in terms of layout, in terms of organization from soldiers, from departments, civilian life, military life, that we just have no idea how it came to be, or indeed how it played out throughout the war. Now, in July of 1861, everybody, North and South, seems pretty convinced that the Union and Confederate Army is squaring up for a major battle just outside Washington, D.C. Then August rolls around. There are a few skirmishes here and there, but by and large, nobody moves. September rolls around. There are some incidents of raids and house burnings along the western side of Alexandria County, Falls Church line, but again, nothing happens. By October of 1861, the Confederate Army all but decides that it's giving up on Falls Church, and they will begin to move out of the area. Once that happens, the Union Army now knows that the war, however long they thought it would last after First Bull Run, certainly has no end in sight. And now is probably a good time to make the fortifications of Alexandria County about as perfect as they can be. So now, Barnard and his engineering team are going to start looking at all the strategic points that they just didn't have the time or the resources to get to in June and July of 61, and really start to lock those locations down for the Union war effort. Most famously, these will be the locations along the 4 Mile Run and just outside of Chain Bridge. Now here, top right-hand corner, we have an image of the battery at Chain Bridge. Now, before September of 1861, if you visited Chain Bridge from Alexandria County, that would have been the site that greeted you once the Civil War had begun. The Chain Bridge was protected by a few batteries north of the Potomac, but nothing south of the Potomac. This was seen as a huge oversight by Barnard and his team, and so in September of 1861, they're going to begin work on 2 new fortifications. Fort Ethan Allen, which is located just within the Alexandria County northern borders, and Fort Marcy, which is just outside of those borders in technically what is now McLean. If you're curious, Fort Ethan Allen is now Fort Ethan Allen Park, and that is one of the sites that we interpret in the Arlington County Department of Parks and Recreation. Fort Marcy is now a national park. It is part of the George Washington Memorial Parkway, and that can be visited as well. Although I should warn you, if you want to visit Fort Marcy, you can only do so through the George Washington Memorial Parkway. There's only one entrance to it, and if you miss it, turning around and trying again will take about 10 minutes. So you really have to prepare for a trip to Fort Marcy. Now, 4 Mile Run was a different matter altogether, because in September of 1861, it occurs to Barnard through the soldiers in the field that if anyone wants to flank this new line of fortifications in Arlington, or if anyone really wants to threaten Alexandria, the best way to do it is by the 4 Mile Run Valley. So in September of 1861, they will also begin construction of these 4 Mile Run fortifications. So these will include Forts Richardson, Blenker, Reynolds, which I seem to have left off of this slide here, and overseeing all of them will be Fort Scott. Now, if we look at the sketch here at the very bottom of the slide, taking up the entire bottom half of the screen, this was a sketch by an artist named Alfred Woad. He sketched the 4 Mile Run Valley. On this sketch, you can see the faint outline of Fort Scott off to the left-hand side of the picture, and you can see the rather prominent picture of Fort Blenker on the right-hand side of the screen. In addition to that, you can also see just how difficult constructing the Arlington Line has become, because now we're not just inhabiting hilltops on farms that have been abandoned by Confederate soldiers. Now we are actively making the land hospitable for forts based on the strategic value of that land. Arlington County will be almost entirely clear-cut of trees by the end of the Civil War, with 1 or 2 notable exceptions. But as you can see here in this sketch, not only do we have the forts, not only do we have the wide open spaces, but we have piles of lumber. The story that we have always been taught is that when Fort Scott was first constructed, it was built on a wooded hill. You had roughly 200 acres of woodland all along the hilltops overlooking 4 Mile Run Valley from the north. To clear that land to make Fort Scott and other defenses, the Union Army had to clear cut it of trees. And supposedly, they did it by cutting halfway through each tree, starting at the bottom of the hill and working their way up to the top. As they reached the top of the hill, they cut down the trees all the way through, then pushed them over to create a domino effect that left the entire hilltop clean. From Fort Scott, you can have a pretty advantageous view of both Washington and Alexandria. And in the opinion of John Barnard, Fort Scott was where the Arlington proper defenses ended. So in his mind, the Arlington Line, in its most basic sense, was Fort Scott to Fort DeKalb, the 4 Mile Run Valley all the way to the Spout Run Valley. Fort Scott is another park that you can actually visit today and still has some Civil War earthworks that we interpret. Not many, not as many as Fort Ethan Allen, but there is still a wall there. Fort Blenker will eventually be renamed Fort Reynolds, and now a Fort Reynolds Park can also be visited. But unfortunately, none of Fort Reynolds survives at Fort Reynolds Park. Now, while all of those forts have their own practical uses, there's a bit of an odd duck of this September 1861 class, and that is Fort Jackson. Fort Jackson was built on the Alexandria County side of the Potomac, right where the Long Bridge connected with Alexandria County. So if you were to take the Long Bridge from Washington into Alexandria in September of 1861, the minute you hit ground there, you would have encountered Fort Jackson. Now, this is kind of problematic because the Long Bridge has with it an accompanying railroad bridge. And part of the reason a fort is built there is to protect the railroad. But if you're going to have a fort there, it would probably help if the railroad can go through it. So when Fort Jackson is constructed, it has to be constructed so that the Long Bridge Railroad can actually go straight through it. The result of which is that Fort Jackson is really never the most important fort to garrison. It's already built behind multiple Union Army forts. It's really nothing more than a transportation hub. And according to Barnard, even though they build the fort there, throughout much of the war, nobody is ever stationed there. As something of a caveat to that note, while many of the forts that we see here are named after either Union commanders or places that were significant to the Union Army, local heroes to the various regiments that built them, Jackson actually gets its name from Alexandria County. At that point in time, that region had already become relatively infamous in the area, as it was the site of the planned federal city of Jackson City, which had gone nowhere. Jackson City, by the start of the Civil War, is really nothing more than a punchline used by Alexandria and DC newspaper writers who use it as something of a synonym for bad land deals. And unfortunately, that legacy continues into the 1860s as Fort Jackson almost immediately becomes the least important fort in Alexandria County. Again, that fort, none of that survives today, but that would be the approximate location of Long Bridge Park, not too far from Fort Runyon. So by the end of September, it should become clear to everybody that we have a pretty good line in place. We have our bridges protected, we have our ravines protected, we have the Arlington Heights locked down. For many people, this would be something of a win. But all of that is going to change in August of 1862, when the Union Army suffers yet another defeat at the Second Battle of Bull Run. When the Union Army is defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run, everyone in Washington becomes convinced that with yes? Oh, okay. After the Second Battle of Bull Run, everybody becomes convinced that with the largest Union Army in Northern Virginia utterly defeated, Robert E. Lee and his victorious Confederate Army must be heading for the District of Columbia. And if they're going to do that, more likely than not, they're going to cross Chain Bridge. So you have this week, late August, early September of 1862, where Barnard and McClellan, who was just coming up from the failed Peninsula Offensive, are all trying to mass as many soldiers as they can around Chain Bridge, planning for an attack that they believe is inevitable. It even gets to the point where Barnard and McClellan are advocating for the abandonment of the works and the complete destruction of Chain Bridge before the enemy can arrive. Now, time passes and the Union Army slowly realizes that the Confederates are not going to follow up Second Bull Run with an attack on Washington. Robert E. Lee will instead cross the Potomac River further to the north, and he will begin his Maryland campaign of 1862. But that's enough of a scare to get everybody in Washington thinking, maybe those Civil War defenses of Washington need a once-over. We can't have a scare like that happening again. So Barnard and a number of other senior military officials will conduct a survey of the defenses of Washington in late 1862. It will conclude in December of 1862. And that commission will conclude a number of things. First off, it will be largely pleased with the existing defenses of Washington in Arlington, but it will recommend a few new additions. Most significantly, it will recommend a new fortification to cover Fort Cass, which will become known as Fort Whipple, and it will require one more fort, built just to the north of Fort DeKalb. This fort will cover the north side of Spout Run, while DeKalb covers the south side. This way, every inch of that ravine will be covered in its lead up to the Potomac River, and no one can sneak into the outskirts of Georgetown. Fort Whipple is going to become part of Fort Myer with Fort Cass, and Fort C.F. Smith is yet another Arlington County Park. If you were paying attention at the start of this program, Fort C.F. Smith is where I work, and I'm actually coming to you live from the Fort C.F. Smith Visitor Center right now. But while the commission only asks for 2 forts, those aren't the only forts that are constructed. Between December of '62 and May of '63, you will see the construction of Fort Whipple and Fort C.F. Smith. You will also see the construction of Fort Berry, built not too far from Fort Myer, and the construction of Fort Morton. Fort Morton was a pre-existing battery. Again, one of the questions was, what's the difference between a battery and a fort? Well, a Civil War fort is going to be a large earthen structure, usually in some sort of circular shaped or half moon shaped design. The fortifications will consist of dirt and sod walls leading down into a gorge that is often protected by pointed branches or pointed sticks called abatis jutting outside of the gorge. Inside the fortification, you would have platforms for guns. You would also have additional covered spaces called magazines and bomb proofs. These would be designed to protect powder, ammunition, and would also provide fallback cover space for the defenders should the forts ever be attacked. A magazine is like that, but on a much smaller level. Whereas a fort like Fort C.F. Smith is designed for 22 guns, a battery is really only designed for a few guns, 2 to 4 to 5, something like that. You're not going to have the same number of semi-permanent interior structures, and your batteries will almost always be connected to a larger fortification. Fort Morton begins as a battery, and in the ensuing reorganization of the Arlington Line, it will be converted into a full-blown fortification. Now, when John Barnard writes his complete history of the Civil War defenses of Washington in 1871, he will refer to Fort Whipple and Fort C.F. Smith as, and I quote, the most perfect and beautiful specimens of fortifications in his line. So I think that's saying something, and it makes me particularly proud that we got to save Fort C.F. Smith. But the commission has a few other suggestions for Washington as well. They also recommend that the garrisons that had previously inhabited the defenses of Washington throughout the war now be assigned to the defenses of Washington as permanent garrisons. Before the commission, the soldiers defending the various Arlington Line fortifications were all really part of the field armies. They were part of the Army of the Potomac, and whoever commanded the Army of the Potomac at a given time would allocate certain soldiers to the defenses. By 1862, Barnard is of the opinion that that really should change. And in his opinion, the soldiers that have been garrisoning the forts this whole time are the perfect candidates. They know the forts, they know the layouts, they have trained with the cannons over the specific topography, and it just makes sense to detach them semi-permanently from the Army of the Potomac into a brand new defensive force. This will see the creation of the defenses north of the Potomac and the defenses south of the Potomac, 2 distinct Union Army divisions attached to the Department of Washington. The defenses south of the Potomac, which will include the Arlington Line, are comprised of men in DeRussey's division. DeRussey's division is named for its commander, Brigadier General Gustavus A. DeRussey. DeRussey had been the commander of the Army of the Potomac's Reserve Artillery. He had been cited for gallantry at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and in the spring of 1863, he is given this relatively independent command guarding the forts south of Washington, D.C. Now, while the individual regiments in DeRussey's division will change out from time to time, DeRussey himself will be the constant commander of the Arlington Line. And for all the sources that we do have on Civil War Arlington, for all the photos, the sketches, the reports, it always saddens me that to date we have not located any kind of memoir written by Brigadier General DeRussey. That's the one that got away in my book. Now, I said many of the soldiers under DeRussey's command will rotate out, but there is a core group of regiments that really do make up what we think of as DeRussey's division. These are the regiments that are in the forts of Arlington before he takes command. They remain in the division until spring of 1864. They go away for about a year, and then they come back in the spring of 1865. Almost all the photographs that we have of the Arlington County forts, specifically Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Corcoran, which is
dropped it.
These are going to be photographs taken of these core regiments after they return to the forts. Now, you'll notice that here I have chosen, well, frankly, my favorite photograph of the Civil War. This is the one that I wanted to have thrown up when we advertised the program. You saw it on Annette's slideshow. You're seeing it again on my slideshow. You saw it when you registered for the program. This photograph was taken at Fort C.F. Smith, and it shows the officers of Company F, 2nd New York Heavy Artillery. The 2nd New York Heavy Artillery were one of those core heavy artillery regiments that comprised of DeRussey's division. Most of the regiments in his command were heavy artillery regiments. A heavy artillery regiment is a regiment of soldiers that are essentially trained to be permanent fort garrisons. Many of them started off as either a regular artillery regiment or as an infantry regiment. But when they entered the Union Army, there was a need for them in the forts. So the infantrymen were trained with cannons, the cannon operators were trained with rifles. And as such, the heavy artillery were trained to be both. They could be infantrymen or artillerymen, depending on the situation. The core group of DeRussey's division includes heavy artillerymen from New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Wisconsin. Those are really the four main states, but again, many others contribute to the division. Now, the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery, this is a group that's near and dear to my heart, and this picture really exemplifies why. This photograph is taken at Fort C.F. Smith in late summer, early fall, possibly August to September of 1865. The heavy artillery units of the Civil War defenses of Washington have long had a reputation as soldiers in a state of inaction. These are the people who sat in the forts and didn't really do anything, and then the war just kind of ended. But that was not the case for the heavies. Because if you recall, I said that there is about a 1-year period where they are not in DeRussey's division. In May of 1864, the Union Army will receive a new overall commander, Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant will instigate a push against all Confederate armies in the field. He wants all Confederate armies engaged with Union armies all the time. To do that, he needs to bolster the Union Army. One of the best places to do that is DeRussey's division, because here you have a division of soldiers that have pretty much done nothing but train for, in some cases, 2 to 3 years. The heavy artillery is all called out of the Civil War defenses of Washington, Arlington, Alexandria, DC, and Maryland, and they are sent to the Union Army of the Potomac right at the outset of the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, the very beginning of what we now know as the Overland Campaign. The Overland Campaign will transition to the Petersburg Campaign, which will then transition to the Appomattox Campaign and end at the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse of Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. So if you're playing along at home there, that is May of 1864 to April of 1865, 1 year. During that 1 year, the Army of the Potomac is almost constantly engaged with the Army of Northern Virginia. Battles turn to sieges, which turn to marches, which turn to new battles, which turn to new sieges. The Union Army of the Potomac is constantly engaged, and the heavies, as the freshest infantry regiments to join the Army of the Potomac, are often in the thick of it. When the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery leaves the forts of Arlington, there are 1,700 men in the regiment. It's a large regiment, even by their standards. Over the course of just that 1 year, the 2nd New York Heavy Artillery will report approximately 1,100 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or missing at some point just in that 1 year. It's devastating. Now, they will be bolstered by new arrivals to the regiment. The draft is very active at that point. Enlistments are still going strong. And by the end of the war, they will have to be combined with another heavy artillery regiment just to keep some sort of structure. So if you look at their numbers overall, it sometimes appears that they don't do that much. But once you actually get to the nitty-gritty of their reports, you realize that their original number from Arlington is all but devastated just in that last year of the war. After the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, they are sent back to the defenses of Washington because they are the permanent fort garrisons. They were not formally in the Army of the Potomac, at least in the eyes of certain people. They were loaned to the Army of the Potomac for that final push. And when the push is over, you get to go back and work in the forts while everyone else gets discharged. This photograph is taken at that moment in time. So here you have about 7 men, all of whom really don't want to be there right now. I have to put a positive note on that because when you get down to the nuts and bolts of the men in this photograph, it's actually a little sadder. Sitting at the center of this photograph is Captain Orlando Bliss. Captain Orlando Bliss is one of the few men who has actually been with the regiment since 1861. He enlisted as a private and at one point had served as the regiment's bugler. So he literally rose through the ranks, starting at the lowest possible rank to become the highest authority in a single company. His first lieutenant was a gentleman by the name of Theodore Wakeman. Theodore Wakeman, at the age of 35, was one of the older men in the regiment when this photograph was taken. He also had not started out as an officer. He had begun his career as an enlisted man and had served as the regiment's clerk. He was a desk worker. Now, subordinate to the first lieutenant would have been the 2 second lieutenants. The second lieutenants to Orlando Bliss included 21-year-old Michael McNulty. Michael McNulty had been an Irish immigrant. When this photograph was taken, he was the newest officer. He had just had his stripes for about a month or two. McNulty had also been with the regiment for several years. He had been the regiment's hospital nurse, so he was stuck in the medical tents. Then finally, rounding out the immediate staff was 16-year-old Edmund Zielinski. Edmund Zielinski had emigrated to the United States from modern-day Poland when he was about 3 years old, and according to some sources, was Jewish. Zielinski left school to take up a commission as an aide-de-camp for a general when he was just 15 years old. And by the age of 16, he is being mentioned in Union Army reports around Petersburg for leading men more than twice his age into battle. Buglers, clerks, nurses, and children. In the summer of 1865, this is what the Union Army command staff looks like. Many soldiers are going home. Many soldiers have died. Many soldiers are deserting before they can go home. And those who are left in Arlington County, those who are left in the Arlington Line, are really the most committed and the best survivors.
John,
As a
can I
yes,
interrupt for 1 second? Can you
yes,
go
indeed.
can you go from left to right in the
Okay.
story and tell us who everyone is?
So I cannot go from left to right because this photograph was not actually marked. We know that the gentleman in the center is Orlando Bliss because Orlando Bliss has a lot of photographs taken of him throughout the Civil War. He was one of those guys who just went to studios and had his portrait taken throughout the war. He has a very distinct face, he has a very distinct nose, and I'm 100% sure that that is Orlando Bliss. Regarding his officers, this is where it gets a little tricky because they're not named. I can tell you, based on other photographs taken at Fort C.F. Smith, that the first lieutenant and the two second lieutenants are likely the two gentlemen to Orlando Bliss's right-hand side and the gentleman to Orlando Bliss's far left side. So if that doesn't make any sense, Orlando Bliss's officers are most likely the man who has no sword, the boy with the sash, and the man with the goatee and the broad-brimmed hat. Now, I cannot tell you definitively which one is which, but again, if we look at our context clues, maybe we can take a guess. The first lieutenant, Theodore Wakeman, is 35 years old and is by far the oldest man of the bunch. Michael McNulty is 21 years old. He is the newest officer of the bunch. And Edmund Zielinski is 16 years old. He's just a child. As a working historian, I cannot say who I think they are, but again, you all have eyes. Maybe you can make some assumptions of your own.
Okay, one follow-up question.
Of course.
What direction is the background of the C.F. Smith photo?
Yeah, so if you are like me and you spend a good chunk of your life looking at Civil War pictures of Alexandria County, how far we've come. It almost looks like Kansas back there. So fortifications in the Civil War, like I said, they're walls, they're gun platforms, they're fallback positions, it's ammo storage. You don't physically live inside of the fort. So I can tell you right now that this image would have been taken somewhere behind Fort C.F. Smith. Fort C.F. Smith is located on North 24th Street in Arlington, Virginia, with all of the guns pointed westward. So this photograph likely would have been taken behind the fort where the encampments and the barracks would have been. It doesn't look like we can see the Potomac River, so I'm going to say that this is not behind the fort facing the north. It is, but on the same token, it is also likely not behind the fort facing east, because the Potomac River does bend when you reach Spout Run, and you should be able to see the Washington skyline if that were the case. So since I can see neither the river nor Washington, I think this is behind Fort C.F. Smith, pointed southwards. So pointed towards Spout Run. Spout Run, the Spout Run Valley is actually very hard to see from many of the Civil War pictures taken in the C.F. Smith campsite. We know it's facing that way because we can see Fort DeKalb in the distance, which was the next fort over, and which would have been located on the other side of the valley. But the valley itself is very hard to point out. So that is my best guess as to what we are looking at. Behind Fort C.F. Smith, facing the south.
Thanks.
Of course. So life in the defenses of Washington will go on. It'll go on throughout the spring of 64, the summer, up through the spring of 65, when the core elements of DeRussey's division finally returned to take up their mantle. But in September of 1865, many of those soldiers are absolutely fed up with Union Army life, and they begin deserting from Arlington County in record numbers. The reason being that by September of 1865, all the Confederate field armies have surrendered, Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated, Jefferson Davis has been arrested, and to the average Union soldier, the war is over. But there's still a need for soldiers in the defenses of Washington. There is manual labor that needs to be done. There are communities that still need to be protected. The arrival of Freedman's Village, a freestanding African-American suburb designed to house and protect formerly enslaved men, women, and children right here in Arlington County, is under constant pressure of harassment from the local population. So there is still a need for the U.S. Army in Alexandria County, even when the Civil War is over. So to meet that need, Ulysses S. Grant will begin letting the heavy artillerymen out of the Army, and he will begin replacing them with USCT regiments. Some of the most famous photographs of the USCT in Arlington are of the 107th USCT, photographed at Fort Corcoran. This is one of those photographs. Now, when the 107th USCT arrives in Arlington, it is October of 1861. They are immediately broken up by county, and they are immediately sent to whatever forts in Arlington still stand. Within about 1 month of their arrival, everything's going to change. In November of 1865, the 107th USCT, which had primarily been attached to the Quartermaster's Department, will be deployed elsewhere to the north of the Potomac. At the exact same time, the Quartermaster's Department will announce that the U.S. government is having a public sale of government buildings, lumber, and timber at all of the sites that had previously been Alexandria County forts. So it is very likely that the members of the 107th USCT have been brought to Arlington both as a final garrison for the county, but also to begin the arduous process of decommissioning the forts and prepare the surplus material for sale. Almost as soon as the lumber goes for sale, the 107th is moved out of the area north of the Potomac. The 107th is one of my favorite regiments to study. They are one of, if not the last Union regiment to be stationed in Alexandria County. They had been raised in the summer of 1864 in Louisville, Kentucky. Many of their members had been formerly enslaved, and in some cases, they either had to escape to the Union lines to enlist, or in other cases, they were actually forced into Union service by white residents of Louisville who wanted to avoid the draft or get military compensation or get monetary compensation for military enlistment. So the 107th has a very tragic story before they arrive here in Arlington. Many of them have friends, family, loved ones still legally held in slavery in the Union state of Kentucky, even as they are marching in the Union blue uniforms. One letter from a soldier who would have been deployed to C.F. Smith, asking for a furlough right before the deployment, makes the case that he wishes to visit Louisville before coming to Arlington because his wife had been sold into slavery 10 years prior and was at that moment only then for the first time living somewhere where it was safe for him to visit. So they are going to spend the end years, the end months of the Civil War here in Arlington, guarding Freedman's Village, garrisoning the forts, and standing watch for what many people thought could be a resurgence of violence. The Arlington Line was many things for many people. For some, it was simply a means to defend Washington from Virginia. For others, like Barnard, it was very explicitly a symbol that the Union capital could not be surrounded, that the Union capital could still exert authority into the secessionist states. But in many ways, it was also a refuge for what could be. Even as the guns grow silent, in Arlington, with the growing Freedmen's Village, with the ever-present eyes of the 107th USCT, seeing that the final job of the military is complete, the Arlington Line suddenly becomes the last vestige of that old way, and whatever was going to fill it would hopefully be better than what had preceded it. In many ways, I believe that that is a mission we are still working on today, and it is for that reason why I am eternally grateful that I get to keep doing programs about the Arlington Line for Arlington Parks and for whatever audience will listen to me. That's really all I have to say on that matter. Thank you all for sitting through me talk for, at this point, I think a little over an hour now, give or take. I hope it was interesting. I hope you had a little bit of fun. I hope you learned something. And I really hope that I get to see you in person at a Civil War fort in Arlington once we're all comfortable going back outside.
That was great, John. Thank you.
My pleasure.
That filled in a lot of blanks for us all. Jessica, do you have questions that you'd like to pose?
I do. Ed would like to know where the heights of Arlington are.
So the heights of Arlington is really a catch-all term for the hills of Arlington that overlook the District of Columbia. In Barnard's opinion, the heights of Arlington began for him at Fort Scott. That was the wooded hill that overlooked 4 Mile Run Valley from the north and is now Fort Scott Park. The heights of Arlington then extend through the Arlington estate, but broadly speaking, visualize all that land on the Arlington side of the George Washington Memorial Parkway. All those big hills covered in trees, that's what everybody understood to be the broad quotes heights of Arlington.
Great. Okay, and Tracy would like to know, how was Arlington House itself used as a fort?
How was Arlington House itself used as a fort? So, well, while none of these major fortifications crop up right in Robert E. Lee's backyard, that does not mean that there is any shortage of Union soldiers camped out on his front yard. The Arlington estate is very quickly going to be turned into the headquarters, first for the Army of the Potomac when they are getting ready for the first battle of Bull Run. And then later, it will become the headquarters for the defenses south of the Potomac. So General DeRussy will use it as his headquarters. Anytime there's a major field army passing through the areas, they will come by Arlington and use it as their headquarters. Freedmen's Village is going to be constructed on the Arlington property. Union dead will soon be buried in the Arlington property, and that will give way to Arlington National Cemetery. So while it is seldom used as a proper fortification, it really does become the hub of all Union Army activity in Arlington County.
Okay. Let's see. Annette would like to know, if you go back to the C.F. Smith photo.
Sure.
With
the officers.
What is the brush? What's the reason for the brush covering the tent and the buggy?
You know what? That is a great question. I can only assume, based on my limited knowledge here, you would do that for extra shade, and you would do that for some sort of element protection. We do a number of kids programs, and occasionally we'll have living history events in Arlington County Parks where tents are assembled. Those tents are about as water resistant as they look. And they have a tendency to overheat if they're closed up. So while I can't tell you exactly what the engineers were thinking when they threw it up, it almost definitely seemed like a good idea at the time.
So it probably was not because they were afraid of balloon photography.
No, I don't think that would have been much of a concern for them at that exact moment.
Okay.
In 1861, 1862, maybe, but no.
Got it. Thanks.
Well, given the photo, I don't see any trees, so I don't even
Exactly.
know where they got the leaves from to put the brush up there.
You
Okay,
know, oh, sorry, I was just going to add there. Fort C.F. Smith is built on the Jewell property. William Jewell had been a tax collector for Georgetown. He'd been a major in the DC militia. And in Alexandria County, he had a 100-acre estate and 6 enslaved persons working it. That estate boasted, at least in the opinion of one of the Jewell sons, the nicest fruit orchard in all of Alexandria County. One of the big complaints of the Jewell family after the war is that the orchard completely disappears. So we could be looking at the last remnants of William Jewell's proud fruit orchard.
Okay. Alan would like to know what the connection is between the armies and regiments you mentioned. For example, the Army of the Potomac and the New York regiments and the U.S. Army.
Okay. So Civil War armies are kind of tricky if you don't really know where they're coming from. When the Civil War breaks out, the United States Army has, I believe, something like 40,000 men in it. It's a very small army. Now, most of those regular army units are out west in the territories where there are Native American tribes that they feel they really need to keep an eye on. So when the Civil War breaks out and southern states start to secede, they start building volunteer armies. And Abraham Lincoln very astutely realizes that he needs a volunteer army too, because he can't rely on the regular army, even if it was close at hand. So when Civil War soldiers enlist in the Union Army, at least in the early days, they're not enlisting in the regular army like we understand it today. They are enlisting as volunteers. It might seem like a semantical distinction, but it is an important one, and one that was certainly recognized by the United States government. So these are temporary soldiers being raised by individual states for federal service. I would say that a good comparison would be the National Guard, but even that doesn't really do it justice. These are volunteer soldiers meeting state quotas for federal service. That is why they have designations like 2nd New York Heavy Artillery or 9th New York Heavy Artillery, because they are New York enlisted soldiers. The field armies, like the Army of the Potomac, will be comprised really entirely of these volunteer regiments. Now, they might be led by regular Army officers, but those regular Army officers will have ranks in the volunteer service. If that's confusing at all, don't worry about it. I'll put it to you like this. The Department of Washington is previously under the command of C.F. Smith. General Charles Ferguson Smith is the commander of the Department of Washington for about a month in 1861. Now, C.F. Smith was in the regular army, and he held a commission as a colonel in the regular army. But when the Civil War breaks out, he is made a brigadier general of volunteers. C.F. Smith does not survive the war, but had he done so, at the end of the war, he likely would have resumed his rank as a colonel in the regular army until he was formally promoted to general in the regular army. To make it even more confusing, like I said, when he's running the Department of Washington, he is commanding militia units, and they have their own designations. So a colonel in the regular army gives orders to a major general in the New York militia. It's strange.
Okay, that helps. Thank you. Let's see. Tom would like to know about how the county acquired the site, and I'm assuming he means CF Smith.
CF Smith. Yep. Okay. So Fort CF Smith was the last like sizable land acquisition to become an Arlington County Park. CF Smith was purchased by the owners of the property in 1994. And I have been told that in 1994, the property, which today is about 19 acres, was the last registered farm in Arlington County. So when Arlington buys the ground that becomes Fort CF Smith Park, it is the official end of farming in Arlington. Although how much farming was being done there in 1994, that's a matter for the accountants, I guess.
Okie doke. Carol would like to know about the restitution process to landowners after the forts were decommissioned.
Aha, so we get to my favorite document collection at the National Archives, the Southern Claims Commissions. The complete files of the Southern Claims Commissions have been digitized and are available online. I strongly recommend them to anyone with an interest in civilian life in Civil War Arlington. In the 1870s, if you were a landowner in a state that had been in rebellion and you had sustained damage from the Union Army, you could apply for compensation at the Southern Claims Commission. But to do that, you had to prove a few things. First off, you had to prove that you were a loyal Union citizen throughout the war, meaning you weren't in the Confederate Army, you didn't send money to the Confederate Army, you didn't send support to the Confederate Army. But in addition to that, you also needed to prove that the land that you had was taken legally as forage by the Union Army, and that some sort of receipt or some sort of witness could vouch that it happened. This is going to be a sticking point for more than a few African American families in Alexandria County, because when they go before the Southern Claims Commission, they are not necessarily afforded the same receipts that a questionable landowner like Vanderwerken was given. And so in some cases, their Southern claims are denied, not because they were disloyal to the Union. They were probably the most loyal Unionists in the county, but because the commission ruled that no, your land was not taken by the Union Army in an official capacity. Your land was stolen by criminals who just wanted your crops. And that is a civil matter. So it's very unfair like that in a number of cases. Now, certain landowners could buy much of their lumber back at auction. Like I said, the trees, all the trees that get cut down, if you want those back or what's left of them, you have to buy them from the quartermaster at a public auction. Vanderwerken will buy much of his lumber back when the Ethan Allen buildings are put up for auction. In terms of compensation for destroyed or eaten crops, the Southern Claims hearing is where that comes into play. And that's where the Union Army is really going to press him on that possibly shady deal he makes for his horses in Alexandria.
Okay, are there any other questions? I think that's the last one on the chat. And I think it is, so.
I got 8:29 on the dot. I think that is a success.
Good job, John. Good job. No, thank you very much. That was very, very, very good. We understand what the difference is between a fort, a camp, and a battery. We understand that who built it, who these people were, and we get a real sense. You told us information that some of us may have never heard before. So that is fabulous and a big, big plus. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. We are learning new things about Civil War Arlington literally every day, and it's just about coming out with the proper programs, the proper venues that we can tell it all, because I love learning it, and I know many of you love learning it, and I am just so happy to have had this opportunity today to talk to you all. You guys were fantastic. Again, if you like what you saw here, if you want more, here at Fort C.F. Smith, we're doing virtual programs. We'll resume our in-person programs in September. Hopefully, that includes walking tours, kids programs, longer form hikes. You can learn all about them at parks.arlingtonva.us.
That's great. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Thank you for filling that in.
My pleasure.
Anybody else? Are we all set? All right. Well, thank you very much, John. That was really great. I look forward to doing more things with you after the pandemic is really over.
You know it.
All right. Good night, everyone. And thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. See you perhaps next month at the banquet.